The first time I noticed it, he didn't do anything wrong. He just didn't look up when I walked in, like my arrival had become part of the furniture. In the beginning, he made the ordinary feel held. We met in a late place, one of those small restaurants that always smells like fryer oil and coffee, where the lights are too bright but somehow still feel like night. He sat across from me and kept his phone in his pocket like it wasn't even an option. I remember his hands, clean nails, a small scar on one knuckle. He stirred sugar into his cup, slow, like he wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. When I talked, he didn't just nod. He waited for the parts people usually rush past. If I said work was weird, he'd ask weird how. If I said I'm tired, he'd ask the kind of tired that sleep fixes or the other kind. It wasn't intense. It was gentle precision, like he was actually trying to find me. He remembered small things I didn't think mattered. The way I hate mint gum. The way I always look out the window when I'm thinking. The way I say it's fine when it isn't. He'd catch it without making it a scene. Hey, he'd say softly, like we were sharing a secret. You don't have to do that with me. And I believed him, not because he promised, because he proved it in tiny, repeatable moments. When we started staying over at each other's places, it felt like relief. He'd fall asleep faster than me. I'd lie there listening to the sound of him breathing, and it would calm something in my chest that I'd been carrying for years without realizing. In the mornings, he'd move around the kitchen in socks, half awake, and put a mug in my hands before I even asked. Sometimes he'd stand behind me while I looked in the fridge, and he'd rest his chin on my shoulder, not romantic like a movie, just close, like he belonged there, like I did too. Moving in together didn't feel like a milestone. It felt like admitting we were already living in each other. We found a place with thin walls and a living room that stayed dim even in the afternoon. At night, the apartment had two kinds of light, warm in the kitchen, cold in the living room when the TV was on. The first week, we kept turning lamps on and off like we were trying to choose what kind of life we wanted. Soft corners, warm shadows, our voices quieter than usual, like we didn't want to scare the peace. We ate on the floor because the table hadn't arrived. He fed me the last bite of something without thinking, just holding it out and letting me take it. I remember the look on his face, absent, comfortable, sure. At the time, sure felt like safety. We had little rituals that made the days feel stitched together. On Sundays, we'd do groceries with a list we never followed. He'd push the cart and bump it lightly into my hip when he passed, like a quiet joke. We'd argue gently about cereal brands. Not real arguing, just the kind that felt like sharing a life. At night, we'd brush our teeth side by side. He'd spit, rinse, and look at me through the mirror with sleepy eyes and say, "Come here." Then he'd kiss me slow, like he had nowhere else to be. When we got into bed, he'd ask, "You comfortable?" And I'd say yes, and he'd pull the blanket up a little higher on my side like it mattered that I was warm. Somewhere along the way, the same routine stayed, but the feeling inside them changed. It started small enough that I didn't trust my own noticing. The goodnight kiss became quicker, not colder, just shorter, like an obligation he could complete while already thinking of something else. The "you comfortable?" question disappeared, not as an announcement. The language of living replaced the language of being. He was still kind. That's the part one couldn't explain without sounding ungrateful. He'd fill my car with gas if he borrowed it. He'd pick up my favorite drink without asking. He'd take out the trash before it overflowed. But I started noticing that when he did those things, he didn't look at me after. He didn't wait for the moment to land between us. It felt like living with someone who cared about my life, but didn't really enter it. One night, I came home with a story ready in my mouth. Not a big story, just something that happened on the way home. A stranger said something odd. I laughed about it alone in the elevator and saved it like a gift for him. When I opened the door, the apartment smelled like warm pasta and dish soap. The TV was on low, casting that cool light across the living room. He was on the couch, shoulders loose, phone in his hand. He looked comfortable, completely settled. I said, "Okay, you'll laugh." He made a sound that meant I'm listening, but his eyes didn't leave the screen. And then I stood there with my keys still in my hand, the metal biting my palm, waiting for him to turn his head even a little. He didn't. So I changed the sentence in real time. "Never mind," I said lightly. "It was nothing." And he smiled, small, easy, like he was relieved it wouldn't require anything. I went into the kitchen and opened the fridge even though I wasn't hungry. The light inside was too bright, too white. I stared at leftovers and condiments like they were interesting. Behind me, I heard him laugh at something on his phone, quick and genuine. That laugh didn't hurt because he was happy. It hurt because I knew it wasn't for me anymore, not even by accident. I closed the fridge and leaned against the counter in the warm lamplight, Feeling the temperature split our apartment into two worlds. Warm where I stood, cold where he was. And I realized I'd been standing in the warm part alone for a while, listening for his footsteps down the hall. Sometimes he'd come out half asleep and say, "You coming?" I'd say, "In a minute." And he'd nod like that was fine. Everything was fine. That was the problem. Nothing was ever not fine enough to stop. The shift showed up in the smallest omissions. He stopped asking, "How was your day?" Not in a dramatic way. Just one day it didn't happen, and then it became normal. I'd come home and he'd say, "Hey," like I was entering a room he was already in. Sometimes he'd kiss me without lifting his eyes from his phone. And I'd let him, because I didn't want to be the person who makes it weird. I became skilled at receiving less without showing it. There was a night the power went out for a few minutes, just a short outage. The TV died, the router blinked out, the apartment went still in a way it never was anymore. We stood in the kitchen with the fridge door closed, listening to the building settle into darkness. I lit a candle we'd never used. The flame turned the walls soft and warm, like a different life. For a second, he looked at me, really looked. He said, quietly, "Kinda nice." And I felt something in me lift. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down. The candle kept burning like it didn't know it had been interrupted. A few days later, I got sick. Not hospital sick. Just the kind where your bones feel heavy and the air feels too cold. He brought me water. He found the medicine. He made soup. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Need anything else?" And I wanted to say, "Stay," but I didn't. I said, "No, I'm okay." He kissed my forehead and went back to the living room. I heard the TV come on again, low volume. That night, I woke up and the apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator hum. I padded out to the living room and saw him asleep on the couch. TV paused. Phone face down on his chest. I covered him gently, and the realization came so calmly it scared me. I loved him. But lately, I'd been loving him the way you love someone you don't get to reach anymore. A week later, we went to a small gathering. He was different there. Awake. He laughed fully. He put his hand on my knee. Everyone looked at us like we were solid. On the drive home, I watched his profile. I said, "You seemed happy tonight." He said, "Yeah, it was good." I waited. He didn't add anything. The silence wasn't angry. It was unoccupied. The next day, I bought a new lamp for the living room. A warm bulb. I wanted to soften the space. When he got home, he walked past it like it had always been there. I waited. He didn't notice. And in that moment, something in me stopped bargaining. That night, I sat in the kitchen with the warm light on. I thought about saying, "I feel lonely with you," but I pictured the defenses. So I stayed quiet, and he stayed comfortable. We kept living. We kept eating dinner. We kept sharing a bed. Sometimes he'd turn toward me in small ways, and I'd question myself. But the distance always came back. The hardest part wasn't missing him. It was feeling like I had to earn the version of him I fell in love with in my own home. One morning, I woke up before him. He was asleep beside me. I watched him like I used to, and I felt this strange grief because he was right there, and I knew if I reached for him, I wouldn't be reaching for the same closeness anymore. I didn't touch him. I just thought, very simply, we didn't lose love. We lost the part where love looked back.